How did Germany recover so quickly from Nazi brainwashing after losing the war? This isn't the complete answer, but I think Allied troops took German citizens to concentration camps immediately after the war to try to show them the full horror of what had been going on. We pretended there were no longer any Nazis in the police, in local government, etc., took all the high-ranking ones to support the Cold War and the space race, and told the myth of denazification, which came true as that generation died out. I strongly advise you watch the recent documentary on Netflix, Ordinary Men, The Forgotten Holocausts, and then think on. They really didn't. Hell, one of the first guys in charge of NATO was one of the higher-ranking members of the Wehrmacht during WW2. My late mother-in-law was a young girl when Hitler got power. She was a Nazi until the day she died in 2001. It wasn't so quick, and there are more than traces today in German society. France, GB, USA, and USSR have been conducting a program of denazification for years, but didn't really complete it. The neo-Nazi movement is a prominent and well-debated issue in Germany until this day, and far-right politics are on the rise at this very moment. Edit. Sorry for focusing on where you were wrong. To answer your question on how they recovered, they had the said denazification program. They had a strong constitutional democracy, invested in education and reconciliation, and had generational shifts. Many didn't. I worked with lots of old folks from the old country in the early 90s. They remained hardcore, full of hate, and said they lost. If you lived in Germany, you would see how that culture evolved, and it's still very strong in Germany's public discourse. They dropped the swastikas, but those social energies are still there in a different form. Here's an article explaining one of these many aspects. https://jewishcurrents.wordbadmemory 2 https://jewishcurrents.wordbadmemory 2. While traces do remain, they took a couple of distinct actions. 1. They made it illegal to be a Nazi. They do not have a legal freedom of speech, and so were able to directly outlaw the ideology. 2. A massive shift in education with a heavy focus on reviewing and taking responsibility for the horrors of the war, including mandatory trips to the concentration camps in schools. It took a long time too, but consistent stringency and education has been very effective at curbing the ignorance that spawns nationalism. The Nazis didn't create antisemitism. They just capitalized on an already existing sentiment that's been present in Europe for centuries. I guarantee you said sentiment still exists. They just don't outwardly express it. It's no different than America, where there are still plenty of racist white people, but most aren't going around saying the N-word in public. To be absolutely fair, that they were denazified is a complete myth, as is the myth of Nazis being illegal in Germany. It's a myth people in the US and UK tell one another. The truth is, in the 50s there was a real danger that Nazis were going to take over Germany again. The further truth is Nazism in Germany didn't go anywhere, but mostly hid, morphed with the modern eras, in some cases removed Hitler to avoid certain laws while 1:1 continuing on Nazi ideologies. This is why most of Eastern Germany is AfD, and they are planning to do much the same things that the Nazis did. Among their ranks are prominent Nazis, including one who more or less establishes the real ideologies of the party. That they are now polling as the number 2 party and will be an extra coalition lawmaking partner in opposition should scare the entire world. Nazis also openly exist in Austria, mostly in the form of the FBO that runs much of the country at points and led to Austria being removed from international intelligence sharing. They did not in some ways. The hardcore ones were repressed by their media, and they just went underground and silent. We executed many of the leaders in a highly publicized way. Not every German was a Nazi. A lot were simply complicit with the authority. They may have not agreed with the mentality, but they also didn't openly go against the status quo. Another demographic of the population was, for the most part, ill-informed, either in a level of delusion or just flat-out unaware. Many Germans weren't even aware of the camps until near the end or after the war. Unlike in the US after the Civil War, Reconstruction was taken seriously in post-war Germany. For one thing, they made it illegal to be a Nazi and to even display Nazi symbols, and they also didn't let former Nazis push a lost cause style of education. Instead, education included teaching all Germans of the atrocities committed by the Nazis. They haven't. They're just good at hiding it. That's why there's an uptick in Nazi propaganda now. With that, it wouldn't be a surprise if that became a part of their culture even after the Nazi regime was gone. It didn't. All over Europe, people kept more or less blaming the Jews for years until information about the camps became too widespread to ignore, and people were economically recovered enough to care. Many Jewish people, gay people, Romani people, etc. came back from the camps to be treated hostile and not even being able to get their belongings back. Yet how is it that despite that not even a trace of it remains now? There are still traces, and while there's often attempts to call current-day far-right extremism an independent reinvention of fascism, the story of the Putschprinz shows AfD is deeply rooted in the Nazi past. Unlike WWI, Germans were forced to face the consequences of their government's actions. One of the reasons for the concentrated bombing of German cities was to make that point. Then there was the occupation of the country by Allied forces and the Denazification process. And finally, despite the weaknesses that allowed Germany to let the Nazis take over, Germans in general were industrious, hardworking, and respectful of authority. When they moved into Germany, some American troops were surprised at how much they ended up respecting the German people compared to the French, the Dutch, or the Italians. And then there was the fact that WW2 pivoted almost instantly into the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and Germans were willing to ally with their former enemies to resist. I think the Jew-Slav hating was introduced to them by a guy who pulled them briefly out of national despair, but was otherwise fringe thinking. People put up with it because he did a good job with the economy. If he sucked at his job, then the racial shit would have stayed fringe. Also, he didn't really start to dissociate the Jews until about 1936, and by 1939 they were in war, and by 1945 their country was in ruins again, and 20 of them were now slaves to the Slavs in the East. If it had gone on longer, maybe it would have stuck harder? Also, the Allies learned from WW1 that reconciliation is better than reparations. Keep dreaming. A lot 1.6 of influential Nazis got employed in the paperclip project in the USA https://m.m.wikipedia.org wiki Operation Paperclip. It wasn't quick. I imagine it helped that there was a lot of media involved in televising their crimes though. I seem to remember groups of locals being brought to see the concentration camps so they could see for themselves what had been happening.